Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Beyond Train podcast. I'm your host, Leo Dalton. Episode 27 today, we have an amazing guest on, Dr. Melissa Sell, talking about a topic that I really think is going to be central moving forward, something that we've been touching on a little bit more recently, something that really resonates with me, something that I can't seem to escape from. So, I love it. I love this topic specifically. We're talking a lot about German new medicine today and, all the branches thereof. And it's really interesting when there's a whole lot of literature out there, a whole lot of books that are on this topic, that the mind creates everything, that the mind is so ever powerful. And um, that's why I think it's so central. It's something that has been talked about a lot through history, something that we continue to talk about. It's something I think humanity can't escape from, I think, because it's so fundamental. Anyways, I should leave it up to the experts, I suppose. Dr. Melissa Sell, thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I love every time, I have the opportunity to talk more, to help people to really tap into what specifically, like what sets, like what Dr. Hammer found apart from the other kind of models of mind body um, dis-ease connection, and really getting the fifth biological law, which I'm sure we'll talk about all the five biological laws today, but the fifth one, it's this beautiful understanding that nothing in nature is meaningless, that it's not even the idea that bad thoughts or negative thoughts cause disease. No, it's that when we have specific experiences that in the moment shock us, catch us off guard, we were unprepared, isolated, felt all alone, and within us, we have inborn adaptive programs that change our tissues. And so it's an experience that occurs that happens in a moment, and then a cascade of adaptations occurs. The psyche brain organ, this connection, it's inherent. So yes, of course, the mind and the body are connected. They are one, and it's how we interface with the world. And the psyche is detecting the safety or danger of our environment every moment of every second of every day. And if we didn't have that, nobody would be here. We wouldn't have this adaptive capacity. And so it's this amazing legacy of life that always strives for more life and always adapts the tissues in order to secure life. And so it's this whole life philosophy, understanding, deep wisdom of how the body works. And so, yes, it's like it goes so much deeper, and it's so intricate and amazing to really explore like all the different facets, all the different tissues, how specifically they can morph and transform in response to a just split second thing that happens to you. Your body knows how to help you through it. And that's like the depth of all that this is.
Cool. Cool. What an awesome way to start. Amazing. I do like to ask my guests a little introductory question as well. And that question is, what is health? And it's a very individual question, I find, usually tailored to people's experience. But I want to know what health means to you. How does it manifest? Generally the philosophy behind what health is as well as. So anything related to that you want to share?
Yeah, I would say that health is adaptability. Health is my ability to assess what's happening in my world, in my environment, and adapt myself to it. Because if I can't adapt, if I can't become flexible in my ability to see what's happening, here's a challenge, here's an obstacle, the whole idea of like I don't believe that there ever is sickness. You are always either adapting or in healing. So the body isn't ever sick. It's always how well and how quickly am I adapting to the challenges that my environment presents to me. So really in this model, you're completely looking at what most people consider sickness in a very different way. Their symptoms are not sickness. Symptoms are indications of tissue that is undergoing an adaptation or a repair phase, adaptation or a repair phase. So you're never sick. You're always either adapting or healing or in homeostasis and in balance, but there's always challenges to life. And so I would say that health is a measure of adaptability and your kind of flexibility and creativity when it comes to dealing with the challenges of being an organism in a body in a world where we have to acquire resources and consume those resources and pass life on to new generations. And so yeah, I would say adaptability, flexibility, and creativity.
Very nice. Yeah. And even in the discussion of homeostasis and balance, it's not like one just achieves homeostasis. It's not like we achieve balance. That's the constant swings of life too. It is this adaptation constantly. Um, yeah, and we've been talking about that a lot too, and even getting into Lamarck's ideas. Um, about how it all just comes down to adaptation, constantly adapting to our environment, and even healing in a way is or the disease process or the healing process is just an adaptation, right? It's just an adaptation to that environment, and we talk about this a lot with microbes, obviously. Uh, that microbes adapt. They don't create their environments; they adapt. So this applies on all levels, and we can relate it to the alchemical tradition, as above, so below, right? So it's obvious that it applies on all of these levels, from the mind to the physical to the spiritual. It doesn't matter what level you want to take it on. So yeah, that's amazing. So maybe you can give us a little spiel about German new medicine, maybe Dr. Hammer's work. You mentioned the five biological laws. I just want to give you the floor and maybe give us a little almost introduction to it, because we haven't specifically talked about German new medicine. I mentioned it in passing, but I'm no expert in it, and I'm eager to learn more. So yeah, I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, for sure. So Dr. Hammer, we have to start with his story because that's where everything began. In 1978, his son went on a trip. He went on a trip to the Isle of Cavallo with his sister, and these young people are just having this beautiful time on a boat in the sun, enjoying themselves. And Dr. Hammer's son was sleeping in this boat, and this crazy circumstance unfolded where the crown prince of Italy, he kind of went crazy. He got mad at the kids. He came out in this dinghy. He had a gun, and he got into an altercation with this other man and shot the gun like this. So this gun was shot by the prince, and it wasn't an intentional shooting, but the bullet went through the wall of the boat and hit Dirk Hammer. And so he obviously is, severely injured and has to get airlifted to the hospital. It's this whole crazy situation, and they try to help him live for 3 months or so. He had his leg amputated. It's like this whole big dramatic situation. And Dr. Hammer, after his son did die, didn't make it through his injuries, and after that, Dr. Hammer developed testicular cancer. And so he had already suspected in his work that there was a connection between, traumatic experiences and cancer, but obviously experiencing it yourself. And, he went on to be the head of an oncology unit in Bavaria. And so that's where he had the opportunity to be, firsthand with a lot of different people experiencing all sorts of different cancers. And he asked every single one of them, did you have some type of, shocking experience prior to the development of your cancer? And so every single time, the answer was yes. But then he started noticing specific patterns that men with testicular cancer specifically had a loss conflict. They lost someone important to them, a loved one, a child, a parent, a friend, a pet. Um, every woman who had glandular breast cancer experienced some type of very severe worry. Everyone with alveolar lung cancer had a death fright shock. Everyone who had a colon cancer had some type of indigestible situation, something they were angry about, could not process. And so this pattern started to emerge from the connections that he's making, that it's like, okay, so something specific happens to this person, and then there's, a cancer in a particular organ of the body. And so he, deduced that obviously there has to be something in the brain. And so he started looking at CT brain scans. And on the brain scan, he started to see another pattern emerge, which were these circles, these rings. Look like, when you drop a pebble into a pond, this little ring formation in a very specific location of the brain. And he correlated to every single time the man had a specific type of, cancer, he would see the ring in a particular zone of the brain, and that's where the cancer would be in the organ. So with the lungs, for example, if you have a death right conflict, there's always a ring in the brain stem. If the cancer is in the bone, it's going to be in the cerebral medulla. And so there's this map that's starting to develop. And Dr. Hammer said, like, as he was realizing these connections, he got weak in the knees. He's just like, am I just in the process of discovering the connections between the specific types of things that happen to humans? And he actually found that this applies to animals and even plants, that we have this connection where something shocking happens. There's a change in the brain and then a change in the organ. And so that's what he went on to call the first biological law, or the iron rule of cancer. So basically, any cancer that happens, there's always a shock in the psyche. There's always something. Again, it has to be isolating, unexpected, highly acute, dramatic, and you feel all alone and isolated in that moment. So it's not just general stress. That's one of the distinctions that's very helpful for people to understand when you're coming from like a stress model of, oh, I'm so stressed, I'm going to get a disease. It's not like that. It's a specific shock of a specific nature that strikes your psyche in a moment where it exceeds your threshold for what you can adapt to in that moment. And so that moment is what initiates and turns on, you could say, the biological special program. And so we don't call this a disease, because it's not a disease means dis-ease, or something is wrong, something's the matter. Something's not wrong in the body. Something's wrong in your experience. Something is other than you want it to be. I was expecting this inheritance, and it turns out I'm not going to get it. That is the dis-ease of that experience, is what causes a person to often experience, typically the correlation is with the pancreas, and it's an indigestible morsel conflict of, I planned on having that money. I've already spent that money in my head, or literally took it out on credit because I thought I was going to be getting this money. And all of a sudden I'm not getting it, or it's held up in court, or there's some type of drama around this inheritance, or somebody wants to take it from me. That's the classic conflict that occurs with pancreatic cancer. And so the body, when you've got this morsel, this thing that you've been wanting, the body's like, ooh, I've already planned on having this. It produces more tissue in the pancreas in order to produce more pancreatic fluids and juices in order to better digest this thing. Because the body, it can only help us with the tools that it has. And all it has are these tissues, these organs. And these organs have the capacity to morph. And the way that they morph is either by building more cells, more tissue in the pancreas gland, more tissue in the alveoli, more tissue in the tonsils. And so, as we're kind of describing this, we're actually talking about the third biological law, which is the organization of how do particular tissues respond to conflicts. And so, Dr. Hammer, he looked, and this was one of the things when I came across this body of work in 2017, and I had already been in the holistic health world for a decade, and I was like so blown away that, because I'm a chiropractor, that's my background. I went to chiropractic school, and, the first half of chiropractic school is all just basic sciences, embryology, histology, learning about, all of the nitty gritty of biology and human physiology. And so embryology was a class that I really enjoyed. I really loved kind of looking at what happens at the very beginning when two cells come together, the sperm and the egg meet, and then this amazing transformation takes place. And so in the unfolding of the organism, we have these basic germ layers. So germination, these original tissue types. And so when the tissues start to differentiate after the sperm and the egg come together, and we have the cells multiplying, and they eventually differentiate into 3 layers, functionally 4 layers. So we have the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm. And so those tissue layers go on to become all the different organs of the body. But the organs are made out of the interweaving of different tissue layers. It's like when you're building a house, you have, you've got bricks, you have wood, you have, plaster, you have all these different, materials that bring the house together. But the different, tissues, the different building blocks determine how that organ functions. And so the most basic functions of the body. So think about the most basic organism floating in the ocean. All it does, it's not worried about society, it's not worried about its self value. All it's thinking about is survival. So taking in nourishment, excreting nourishment, respirate, breathing in some way, and reproducing. That's all it does. And so that is the endodermal tissues controlled from the oldest portion of the brain, which is the brain stem. These tissues are all about nourishment. They're all about bringing in food. So that morsel conflict. I need to digest this thing. And so when we digest, what do? We either are secreting juices, so fluids, so that we can better kind of break down the food item, or we're absorbing. And so when these conflicts happen, when we have some type of morsel conflict, whether it's a sound morsel, an air morsel, a food morsel, a visual morsel, these tissues proliferate. So we grow more tissue when we have this type of conflict, because the biology is scanning the circumstance that you're dealing with. And it says, in order to get through this, we need more saliva. And a great example of this, and it also illustrates how we can have a conflict on behalf of someone else. So we've got a mother and her little 3.5 year old child, and the 3.5 year old, he's really into playing with coins. He's just loving coins lately. And every time she's, somewhere and there's coins involved, he's like, oh, can I have some of these coins? And so he's got the coins. And so they're sitting next to each other on the bus. And he turns to his mother and says, oh, mommy, the penny's in my belly. And she's like, oh my gosh, and she's like, that was a big coin. And she gets obviously shocked. Oh no, is this coin stuck in my child's esophagus? Is it going to be stuck somewhere in his body? Is this like, is he going to be okay? And so in that moment, her biology, because her child is dealing with something that could be potentially life threatening, her biology says, I need more saliva, because again, what was she was concerned that it was going to be stuck in his esophagus. And so her mouth started to produce, she started to hypersalivate in response to this conflict for her child. Because what did the biology read? Coin stuck. What do we need if the coin is stuck? More juice. And so that's like how kind of primal and basic, but you can also see how functional and important it is that we have these. So every adaptive program that's in the body, like there was an ancestor somewhere along the way that survived because it was able to produce a little more juice. So another biological conflict that can occur is like, think about animals in the wild. What do? They have to mark their territory. And so one of the conflicts is a territory marking conflict. If I can widen my urethra in order to produce, like to expel more urine, if animals can smell me more than they can smell you, I'm going to win the territory. So again, we can see just the vital
Yeah.
biological purpose in every one of these programs. And it makes the most sense through the ancient, we have to think a long time ago. Don't think in the modern context. A lot of times people, because they're so stuck in the modern mindset, they're like, it doesn't make any sense that the body would do that. That's not going to help us. It's like, well, don't think about now. Think about thousands of years ago. Think about how vital and important it would be for the body to be able to make more juice, make more. So the next layer. So that's, we got the endoderm, brainstem. We're building more tissue in order to better digest or to better absorb something. The next layer is control from the cerebellum. And so you can see as the brain has unfolded and developed, we've got brainstem, most basic. The next layer is the cerebellum, and this controls the tissues of the body involved in like protection. So we have the dermis, so the deep layer of skin, the sweat glands. We also have the pleura, the pericardium. So these are like these thick protective coating layers in the body. And the theme is attack and protection. And so the conflict is feeling attacked or feeling soiled in some way. And so if, so a melanoma, for example, that's some diagnosis people will get of a melanoma. And conventional medicine thinks it's a scary, terrible disease that's just going to spread all over your body. But in this model, we look at, okay, the melanoma, where is it located on the body? And how did you feel attacked or soiled, dirty, defiled, disfigured at that location. Something happened there that caused your deep biology to say, I need to build a shield. And so that's what the melanoma is. It's a shield. It's a protective barrier that was built in order to protect you from whatever mean words. If someone stabbed you in the back, if someone pointed their finger at you and made an accusation like this, you could feel like right on your chest, you could get a little melanoma. That's the funny thing about melanomas too, is they'll say, oh, it's sun, it's but they're often in places where the sun does not hit directly, underneath clothes, in areas where maybe you were touched inappropriately and felt soiled or attacked by it. Also the breast glands belong to this layer, because the breast glands are modified sweat glands, which belong to this corium skin layer controlled from the cerebellum. For the woman, it's a nest worry. It's a deep concern for the well-being of your child. So like if your child was bitten by a dog and is bleeding, oh my goodness, this terror, this absolute worry for my child. Is my child going to bleed out? Now we can call 911, get them, IV fluids and make sure they don't lose too much blood. But again, hundreds, thousands of years ago, if a mother, her child gets bitten by a wolf or some, wild animal, she doesn't have that access. And so her body can produce bigger breast glands. And what's that for? To produce more breast milk so that this child has a chance of surviving. So again, all of these programs are built around survival. So that's the old mesoderm, control from the cerebellum. Next, we have the cerebral medulla, and these are the connective tissues of the body. So we've got the bones, the ligaments, the fat tissue, the blood vessel. So anything that's connective tissue in the body has the theme of self-value. And so this is the self-devaluation conflict. So if I'm feeling broken, if I'm feeling not enough, not strong enough, not smart enough, the tissues, depending on how intense the conflict is, and this is again how absolutely brilliant and specific the biology is at reading the intensity of your situation. If it's a more superficial type of conflict, it'll hit the fat tissue or the blood vessels. If it's a more moderate type of conflict, it'll hit the lymphatic system. If it's severe, like if someone says, think about the language we use too. Oh, to the bone. It hit me, to my core, the core of me. That's going to affect the spine. I wanted to bite his head off. That's the teeth. Like, think about the language, because the language grew out of the experience. So the experiences came first, and then we developed this language to describe these deep sensations that we were experiencing, of wanting to bite someone's head off, or I couldn't stomach that, or it hit me like a bolt of lightning. That's the conflict shock. When we say these words, that's like this experiential description. And this one was really particularly interesting to me as a chiropractor, because I would have, patients come in and they would do everything that I'm recommending. Let's get rid of the inflammatory foods, and let's clean up your diet, and let's get rid of the, the toxins, and let's do all of these exercises and get these adjustments, and, take care of your posture. And people would do it, but still they occasionally would still have pain. And it's like, what's the deal with that? Because something I was never addressing. I addressed like overall like positive mindset. But we never talk specifically about how the neck is associated with an intellectual or injustice, self-devaluation conflict. And so if you're going around saying, oh, I'm such an idiot, oh, I'm so stupid, or feeling like if you got a word wrong in the spelling bee in second grade and you've been feeling like an idiot ever since, every time like you talk to an authority, or every time you have to kind of be on the spot, you intellectually devalue yourself. That's something that just kind of hides in the background of your experience. And you're like, yeah, I got this chronic neck pain and I do all of these things to try to fix it, but I still have it and I haven't gotten rid of it. We haven't identified your intellectual self-devaluation conflict and how it comes up. Because what happens is something happens once to us, like when we're a kid, and then it runs on a track. We get reminded of it in certain circumstances. And so that became so fascinating to me. Like a person, I remember working with a woman, with frozen shoulder. And it's like, oh, what's the deal here? We're doing all these adjustments. Again, she's cleaning up her lifestyle. She's doing all of the recommendations, but the shoulder. And I had no idea at the time to look at her relationship, because the shoulders are related to, if it's your dominant side, it's like your romantic partner. If it's your non-dominant side, it's related to your mother or your child. And so, it's like, oh, there was probably something going on in her relationship where she felt devalued and stuck. And that was the reason that she was having this chronic frozen shoulder. And she could have the best diet. She could, be living the most non-toxic, holistic, organic lifestyle. But if we don't address the self-devaluation conflict in her relationship, this symptom is going to persist. And that's the thing that really, struck me about this body of work, is that, I was in the world of doing all, like, the cleaning up your lifestyle. Like, that's what I thought was the cure all. I thought that was the answer to sickness. However, every so often I would have these experiences where people in that world who were super healthy, like the healthiest people. They had the best quality everything. They had they cleaned up everything in their external environment, to be in alignment with their understanding of health and well-being. But they'd get a diagnosis. They'd have a heart attack, or have cancer, and it's like, whoa, what happened there? If my model for understanding health was correct, these people should be completely cancer free. They shouldn't have any of these diseases. But when I learned this map, it was like, oh, this is how people with the healthiest lifestyles can still develop these symptoms and diseases. It's because it's not a disease. It's their body is appropriately adapting to their experience, their self-devaluation, their death fright conflict, their worry or their separation. And so now we are on to the last of the layers, which is the ectodermal tissue. And this is controlled from the cerebral cortex. And so this is the most recently developed layer of the brain. And this has to do with society. This has to do with our social hierarchy. It has to do with sexuality and territory and separation and closeness. So the ectodermal tissues, like everything on your skin, all this outside stuff, this is all the hair, the skin, the nails. This is all squamous epithelial tissue, and it has to do with the separation conflict. And so separation has to do with either I want contact or I don't want contact. And so when this conflict occurs, there is erosion, there's loss of tissue. Same thing for the new mesoderm. Actually, I forgot to mention that when we were going over the bones and the tissues. So the old organs, the old mesoderm and the endoderm, those tissues have proliferation. So we grow extra tissue during the conflict, followed by tissue decomposition during the healing phase. And so we use bacteria. So like you mentioned before, bacteria, they are our friends, they are our microsurgeons, our helpers. They live in every layer of the body, has certain microbes that operate in the endoderm, in the old mesoderm, in the new mesoderm, and they are there to help. So once we build up extra tissue in the, let's say the tonsils, for example, the tonsils have to do with a morsel conflict. The classic example is the child wants to eat the cookie, wants to spit out the broccoli. And so they have this conflict of, oh, I have this morsel that I want to take in. And so the tonsils swell up during the conflict. We build extra tissue during the conflict active phase. And then once you resolve it, once you get your morsel that you wanted and you were able to spit out the broccoli and eat the cookie, then there is decomposition. So when a person has like white patches all over their tonsils, the bacteria are breaking down the tissue that's no longer needed. And so it's going through this holistic, or like, it's an endogenous process. It's not from outside bacteria. That's the conventional model, is outside bacteria got inside and made my tonsils sick. I got an infection. An infection means something bad is where it's not supposed to be, and we need to wipe it out. But what's actually happening is it's an inborn process of the bacteria are always there. They're always there, just hanging out, waiting for their moment. Their moment is when the conflict goes into healing. So the second biological law is the law of two phases. And this just describes the progression of the biological special program. We have the conflict. When the conflict happens, I want to eat the thing, I want to spit the other thing out. Okay, so when I'm in that conflict, I'm in this heightened sympathicotonic phase. So sympathetic, fight or flight. And so my hands are cold. My mind is constantly ruminating on the conflict. How am I going to get that cookie? How am I going to spit this broccoli out? Like, I'm trying to figure out, how do I solve this conflict? And so during that time, there's proliferation of the tissue. In the case of the tonsils, growing, growing, growing until I resolve it. And then the body shifts into the parasympathetic phase, the vagotonic phase. And this is where there's swelling. So, oh my goodness, my child, their tonsils, they're all swollen up. They can't swallow very well. They're kind of tired and lethargic. And there's white patches all over the tonsils. That's when the modern person says, my child is sick. I need an antibiotic. But the person who knows the map of the 5 biological laws says, aha, my child experienced a morsel conflict related to their tonsils. They wanted to produce more saliva to better take in something that they desired, which is the right tonsil, or better to spit out something they did not desire, which is the left tonsil. And now the white patches mean that the bacteria are doing their job. Our seasonal workers have been turned on, and now they're decomposing the tonsil material, the tissue that's no longer necessary. And so this is going to go on. So, how long did my child throw a fit about that thing that they wanted? Well, it was about 2 days. They just couldn't get it off their mind. They just wouldn't let it go. They wouldn't, it's like, okay, so about 2 days, this, you'll be through this in a couple of days, because the length of the conflict determines the length of the healing phase. And so once you kind of go through the healing phase, you're going to be tired because the conflict, you're active, you're not sleeping very well. You're in this heightened state. And then when you chill out, oh, now I'm really fatigued. I can't get out of bed. Oh, I feel so crummy. This again is when the person thinks they're sick. They're in the restoration phase. Your body is going through. And so the language and the way that we change our descriptions of what's going on in my body at a given time. Pain usually means healing. It means swelling. When there's swelling, there's healing. That means that the tissue is going through this transformation where it adapted during the conflict. So we either grew extra tissue or we eroded tissue. So that's the other thing that can happen is loss of tissue. In the bone, that's what happens. When you're devaluing yourself, your bones are eroding. A very interesting thing that Dr. Hammer discovered, and this is when you actually think about it, this was something I'd never thought about before I came across this map, is the whole idea of bone metastasis. And so metastasis in the conventional world, this is this idea that cancer is this kind of bad mistake that's happening in the body. Something horrible has happened and your DNA has been damaged. And now the DNA, there's just cells replicating out of control. So that's what they say, like that's what causes cancer. So cancer, let's say there's a tumor in the prostate. And so they say that, oh, well, you've got a tumor in your prostate. And if they do an x-ray and they see that there's cancer also in the bone. So cancer on the bone is actually loss of bone. It's like holes in the bone. But think about this. How does an extra tissue in the prostate, so growing tissue in the prostate, right? There's a lump, there's more tissue. But now we're saying that the cancer in the prostate has, quote, metastasized. So that specific cancer has spread itself to the bone. But the thing is, in the bone, there's holes in the bone. There's less tissue in the bone. So there's more tissue in the prostate or in the breast. So we've got a lump, right? We've got a lump, extra tissue here. And somehow conventional medicine has made us believe that the extra tissue that's here has spread and has caused holes in the bone. Does that make sense? It doesn't make any
Wow.
sense. When you actually think, I was
Yeah.
like, wow, I'd never actually thought about that before. And so what Hammer discovered is that cancer does not metastasize from one site to another. Because if it did, one, we'd have to see it in transit. You'd at some point, somebody would come across a cancer cell in transit through the lymphatic system. Well, one, the lymphatic system isn't connected to the bone. And so there's no way for that to even take place. And so, okay, well, what if it's the blood? They don't test donated blood for cancer. And they've never seen a cancer cell
Yeah.
in transit through the bone. Also, if cancer was spreading through the blood system, wouldn't you think we'd see more cancers of the heart because the blood always has to go and make contact with the heart? You'd think that, and
Mm.
that's one that's quite rare. And so it's like, what else could be going on? And Hammer discovered it's additional conflict shocks. And so when a person, so the conflict for the prostate has to do with feeling not manly enough. So if your partner cheats on you, this is typically for a man who is older rather than a young man. If he's cheated on, he'll typically have a territory conflict. But an older man, if he's cheated on, he will have like a prostate conflict. And so his prostate gets the message, I need to become more robust so I can produce more prostatic fluid so that my semen is muskier. And so the women will really know that I'm a man, right? So again, think
Interesting.
biologically. And so the prostate will grow, and he's also feeling devalued sexually, because again, if he's been cheated on, or if his partner doesn't pay him attention anymore or demeans him in some way, he's feeling a sense of self devaluation along with this prostate conflict. And so if a man, is having issues with his prostate or with urination, he goes in and gets checked out. They scan him and they say, "Oh, sir, you have, stage 4 prostate cancer," which means you've got it in your prostate and also in your bone, rather than telling him, "Hey, man, what's been going on in your relationships? What's been going on at home? Because you had a manliness conflict and you've been devaluing yourself." That's what the scan, like when you look at the tissues, it's telling you about the person's experiences that they had. Oh, you had a deep worry. Who are you worried about? If a woman has lobular breast cancer, it's like, okay, who are you worried about? If she's got ductal cancer, who are you separated from? How did you feel devalued? That's how this map gives us this depth into the human psyche, into the
Yeah.
experiences of these people. And it's absolutely criminal. So Dr. Hammer, in 1981, when this whole map was like starting to come together, and he wrote a thesis and he submitted it to the University of Tübingen, and they will not look at it. They will not officially look at it. Behind closed doors, they looked at it, they validated it, they know that this is true. The thing is they could very easily, if this was not true, they could easily look at it, debunk it, tear it to pieces, put it out there for the world to see what a lunatic this man is. They don't look at it and nobody knows about it, and it's hush hush, because it is true, not because it's not true. And so, this has been around, and it's absolutely, I think it's the biggest criminal thing that has happened, crime against humanity, that this information isn't known, because people are out there being diagnosed with these cancers and not being told about the connection to their experience, and they're being told they've got something crazy scary going on in their body, and if they don't cut the organ out and radiate it and chemo it, that's their only chance. Not even saying, it's like, that could still be an option for people, but this should be an option too. You know what I mean? Like if a person wants to go that route, but the fact that it's not even presented at the table of potential things that you could look into to figure out what the heck is going on with your body. Um, and so loss of tissue with the bone, loss of tissue also with the ectoderm. And so again, like this takes a lot of studying and like to really like, okay, how does this tissue work? And I have a class that meets every Monday. And that's how we just talk about, what does this tissue do? How does this function? What does this symptom mean? How do we kind of take this apart and understand what it means in terms of experience? And so if you don't get it on the first pass through, it does take several times to understand how each of these tissues functions. But once you do, it's like, of course, this is the thing for me and everybody I've ever talked to about this. They're like, it just makes so much sense. It's just logical. And it is. It's biological. It's the logic of life. It's the logic of nature. It's the logic of how life continues happening, is through this very intelligent ability that our body has to morph our tissues in response to shocking things that occur.
Mhm. Awesome. Great overview. Yeah. Yeah. And a couple thoughts that I have there. Um, one of the major one is thinking about, we see cancer, it's the result. It's not a cause, right? And we look at it as the cause of something, but it's the result of this more intricate story behind. And we see it in how we split the fields, how modern medicine is solely concerned with the materialistic construct of the body and the labs and the biochemistry and whatever it may be. There's no They pay no homage to a person's story, and that I think is problematic. And, you know, I study psychotherapy, and, you know, it's almost like the opposite. There's too much of a focus on the cognitive side of things. It's like CBT everything, CBT this, CBT that, right? Everything's so like, deal with it from like this cognitive level, and you're just, everything is just so disconnected. And that I think is a major problem in how we approach healing and how we approach health in general, is just this disconnection. But I like how this approach certainly brings it together. And I think what you're saying makes sense. And, it's funny when you're talking there about all these different connections. It's like, okay, well, I know somebody with this condition, and yeah, you know what? They were stabbed in the back. They were stabbed in the back, and they got, skin cancer on their back. Like, what? Like that probably happened. I've had those connections, at least 10 connections when you were explaining that. So it's just absolutely amazing. It just makes sense. So funny, so funny. But I mean, it's very hard to deny. And I think, yeah, absolutely, it's not something that they can necessarily give us an option to pursue because, well, it doesn't make nearly as much money. And I think fundamentally that's probably the issue at hand there. But yeah, so I wanted to ask, I had a couple questions pop up through it, that whole thing, but I think I want to start with um, maybe you can distinguish kind of the chronic degenerative diseases versus maybe the more acute things. Like, is it sort of in the level of trauma that's occurring or the level of the infraction, the conflict that's occurring, whether it's going to be chronic or acute? Like I know you mentioned the conflict of not wanting to eat the broccoli and eating the cookie and you get the tonsillitis, right? That seems more acute in nature, but then when you're getting to things that are chronic, like cancers and things of this nature, it seems to be related to larger events that seem to create very large conflicts in an individual. So I'm sure you could touch on that a little bit more there.
Totally. So yeah, the thing that it depends on are the tracks. So these are the reminders of the conflict. And so either you're in the conflict active phase. And so something that can happen is you can have a hanging conflict where there's a conflict and there's just no resolution for it. You are in the conflict for a really, really, really long time. Something interesting Dr. Hammer discovered is that certain conflicts, if you're hanging in the conflict for more than 9 months, that you should not ever resolve that conflict because the amount of conflict load that it builds up in the brain when the healing phase. So if you have this conflict that's been building for 9 months, 2 years, 12, 12 years, it's like you don't want to resolve that conflict. So there are situations where conflicts shouldn't be resolved simply because Hammer found that once, if someone does resolve that conflict spontaneously, that the brain can't contain the amount of swelling that would be necessary for the healing. So there's kind of a limitation of the tissue where, and an example of this would be like a territory loss conflict for, let's say, a right-handed man has a territory loss conflict. And so this is where he's, bitten down by a superior. And the way that this works is kind of in the wolf pack. And so in the wolf pack, there's an alpha, there's one leader, and it's basically the biggest and the strongest. And he's the one that's in charge of reproduction. He's the one that, kind of determines where the pack goes. And so if a young up and coming wolf is like, I'm going to see if I can be the alpha. So he challenges the alpha and he either, succeeds and wins or he gets bitten down. And so if the wolf gets bitten down, he loses his territory. He will have a territorial loss conflict, which makes him a beta wolf. He's submissive to the alpha. He listens to the alpha. He's no longer in charge of reproduction. He's a helper to the alpha, is basically how that works. Now, if that goes on for years, and he all of a sudden is like, I'm going to try to be alpha again, he can't survive that if it goes on for more than 9 months. He will have, because the territory loss control center in the brain is related to the coronary arteries. So this is where a heart attack comes from. A coronary heart attack. There's different types of heart attacks, but this is specifically of the coronary arteries. And so an example of this in the human world was, let's say there's a man who's always, his whole life, he's been, trying to climb the corporate ladder, but he's never been fully on top. He's just been, kind of trying to defend his territory, but he's not the alpha. He got bitten down at some point. And then finally he retires. So his whole life he's in this territory conflict. And then he retires at 65. And now he goes and becomes the head of the bird watching club, because he's like, this is, my chance to kind of, be the big dog, be the guy on top. Like I've been, fighting the rat race my whole life. And now, I'm free. I'm, retired. This is awesome. Head of the bird watching club. And he goes out and he's playing golf and he's watching birds and enjoying himself, and then drops dead of a heart attack, because that was the type of conflict that he kind of shouldn't have resolved, because in nature there isn't a retirement, there isn't a pension, there isn't now you have the chance to be a boss somewhere else. In nature you kind of would stay at that level of hierarchy indefinitely. And so, so
Oh,
as far as, so that's
interesting.
considered a hanging conflict. But there's also something
Interesting.
called a hanging healing. And so this is where a person, and this is like the chronic thing you're talking about. Let's say if someone's dealing with chronic arthritis or chronic psoriasis, and their skin, it's just like, oh, I can't get a break, or their joints just hurt all the time. And sometimes it's a little better, but it's pretty much always there. What that is when a person has a self-devaluation, that's the joints, that's arthritis. And let's say it's the hands. The hands, it's about my performance. What do I do with my hands for my work? Am I an artist? Am I, what do I do? Am I a painter? Am I a chiropractor? When I worked with my hands a lot, I would sometimes devalue myself. I would say that I've got a couple of joints that are a little thicker. So the joint during the healing phase gets bigger, because that's the whole purpose of it. It's loss of tissue. And it's like, oh, I didn't give a good enough adjustment, or, oh, I've been working so hard with my hands, or I don't know if I'm up to this, and I'm devaluing myself and my capacity and my abilities. There's breakdown of tissue, and then during the healing phase there's buildup. And so if a person has like really knobbly thick joints because of chronic arthritis, what that tells us about their experience is they have had a chronic devaluation, self-devaluation conflict with regard to the area of the body. Let's say there's an athlete who, and this is how you can have an injury. So there's a couple of things that are outside of biological programs, and that is injury, poisoning, and malnutrition. So deficiency. So let's say someone has an injury though, and it was an injury, someone blindsided you and took your knee out, and you tore stuff. But in the wake of that, so let's say if you are an athlete and you have this major injury that takes you out of the big game or makes you miss a opportunity for a scholarship or something, the injury that you had, often people will relive that through devaluation. I've got a bad knee, I have this injury. And so it's like almost as though the injury never heals, because every time you think about the sport, engage in the sport, even walk around, you're like, oh, my bad knee, oh, my bad knee, oh, my bad knee. And so devaluation, so you go through these cycles. So when there's chronic things, that means that the person is stepping on the track. So if you're chronically symptomatic, you're stepping on a track related to that conflict. And the key is to figure out, when did I first have that devaluation? Or with the skin, with psoriasis, it's about separation. Either I want to bring you close, or I want to push you away. I worked with a woman who she really wanted to be divorced for a very long time, and just couldn't bring herself to do it for years and years. And then she finally did it. And when she did it, she was relieved, but she broke out in this terrible psoriasis on her chest. And she's like, gosh, what could this be? And she did all the things. She did the red light, and she did the coffee enemas. She tried everything to try to like clean this, to clean up her terrain, clean her body up, so she could get rid of the symptom. But when we identified when the divorce happened, so she was happy about being separated from the ex-partner, but she had a child, and the child was going to have to go to that person's house, now separated from her. And so every time the child had to go to see the father, every time there was a court thing every time that there was any kind of interaction about my child, where do you hold your child? You want to keep your child right here, snuggled up against you, but your child has to leave you, separate from you, and go somewhere where you think there's emotional abuse going on, where you're just like, oh, I don't want that to happen. And so that was her separation conflict. So again, it's like we have to look at the okay, it keeps happening. And so every time it's like, okay, we'll get a little better, get a little worse. It's like, oh, well, he didn't have to go to his dad's for a couple of weeks, and it started to clear up. It's like, oh, but then he has to go. And that's what we have to look at with a chronic issue. What chronically are you being exposed to that's causing you to have this, the separation reminder, or, with digestion? So this is also a great place to start talking about like allergies, because, if the
Sure. Yeah.
skin breaks out
Yes.
in response to a food, or, and that's the funny thing about allergies is like, oh, I have like gluten is bad, and but gluten for some people causes, diarrhea. For somebody else, they could flare up in hives. And it's like, okay, well, that's interesting. So if how does the gluten differentiate? I'm going to be hives in this person, I'm going to be diarrhea in this person. How does the substance, how does the food, the strawberry, how does it decide I'm going to cause, acne for this person, I'm going to cause, a swelling up of their throat for this person? Well, it doesn't have to do with the food. It's not the food, it's the person. And it's the conflicts that were in the person at the time when the food was present or in the environment in some way. And so the biology is super smart and it remembers. And so if think about a little animal down at a water hole, about to sip some water. There's a juniper bush, and all of a sudden, a predator comes out of the bushes and attacks you, and you almost die. You just get away. The next time that there's juniper near you, you're going to smell that, and if you had a death fright conflict, the body is going to reactivate that program because it's the difference between life and death. If we can turn the program on a second in advance and make the tissue adaptations necessary, it's going to help us. And so that's what the ancient biology is reacting to. So that's what an allergy is. So if you have a symptom every time you eat bread, it tells us, well, one, what's the symptom? Oh, it's cramps in my stomach or it's, diarrhea. Okay, so that means that bread was in your system when you had a conflict of an indigestible morsel, something I can't stomach, something I can't handle, something I'm angry about, feeling cheated. There's a lot of different, kind of sub descriptions of how, and that's what you have to test for. You have to kind of, so there's like, and that's why when you hear these descriptions, there's like a specific signature. There's like a vibratory signature of every single conflict type. And so that's where like you have to kind of, okay, which one is it for me? How exactly did I experience it? What was like the felt sensation? Again, beyond words, we have to get to like that feeling inside, because that's why babies can have conflicts, fetuses can have conflicts, animals can have conflicts, but they don't have language. Sometimes people are like, well, a baby or a fetus, they don't have words, because it's not about words. Language comes after. When you have a biological conflict shock, you're not thinking, I'm having a death fright conflict. I'm having a separation conflict. The description comes after the experience. And so your psyche is not the conscious mind. Your psyche is your entire awareness of existence, and it's detecting everything in your environment. And so it is determining which conflict or which biological program gets activated, not your conscious mind. Because sometimes people will be like, oh, this crazy thing happened to me. What symptoms am I going to get? And we actually don't know. We can't predict on the front end because every individual is individual. They are unique in the way that they experience their life. So, like a divorce or someone getting cheated on, we can't say, oh, that always causes this symptom. We can say it generally could cause, a separation, a sexual self-devaluation, a sexual frustration. It could cause a couple of different things, but until you resolve it, we don't really know how it affected you as an individual. And so those are just some descriptions and distinctions that it's like, oh, okay, so that's how this works. It has to do with the conflict, with the person, with how they perceived it, with what was going on in their environment. Again, a person can be a track. Sometimes people be like, oh, it almost seems like I'm allergic to my husband. And it's like, well, actually you are, because he was there. I'm allergic to my parents. And, there's tons of stories of kids who just kind of grow out of allergies or they grow out of asthma and they had it for years and then they don't have it anymore. It's like, well, why is that? It's because their parents were tracks that were reminding them of the conflict. And then when they moved away and they were no longer under direct control of their parents, they're like, oh, that conflict naturally resolved. And a conflict is resolved when it can't happen again. So, if you're over 18 and you're out of your parents' house, they can't ever ground you again. And so whatever conflicts and tracks you had about being grounded, it can't really happen again. And so you don't even have to think about it. You don't have to have a conscious awareness of resolving the conflict. It just falls away. So if a symptom, it's like, oh gosh, I used to have that. Yeah, I used to have dandruff or I used to have this. I don't really have it anymore. Huh, that's weird. That's because we're naturally resolving conflicts all the time as we move into different stages of life. Like if a person gets married or if a person has a child or if a person gets a dog, conflicts that were present in a previous experience of life can fall away. That doesn't mean they necessarily will, but they often do as you kind of grow up and evolve and mature and change your perspective on things. Old conflicts will fall away. But then also we can intentionally do it. It's like, gosh, I am allergic to pistachios. How do I stop being allergic to pistachios? Well, think about it. I actually was allergic to pistachios. And I would get, my throat would swell up like super big every time I ate them. I was like, what's the deal with that? And I thought back to a time when I was a child, and I remember my parents, they kind of worked opposite shifts. And so my dad was at work, and we were waiting for my mom to come pick us up. And we were like sitting in the car, and me and my brothers, we were like starving. And all that there was a bag of these pistachios. And I just remember eating so many of them. And so it was like this morsel conflict. I need to swallow. I need to eat these pistachios because I'm starving. And they became this track. And so I'd get this like swelling back in like my tonsil area every time that I would eat pistachios. But when I remembered that conflict, oh my gosh, pistachios are associated for this morsel of like, oh, I'm so starving. I need to eat something. And this is all that was available. And so when I remembered that, I stopped having swelling every time that I would eat pistachios. And it's like, oh, because it can't happen again. I'm never going to be in a situation where I'm dropped off in a car with, and nobody, like I'm an adult. I can go to the store. I have my own food. I have my own money. I'm never going to be in that dynamic again. And so just that realization turned the program off and turned off the track. So it's like my biology gets like, this is no longer necessary, and it terminates the program.
Cool. Yeah. So what can we do? Like, what can you do on the front end? Is there a preventative measure for this? Like, is there a way to build resilience to this, like psychological resilience? I know you mentioned that it might not just be like think positive thoughts all the time or something like that, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, for me, it's about, because there's the whole idea is that it's unexpected and stuff happens. And so, in how you respond in the moment when that stuff happens, you can't in that moment necessarily prevent it from happening. But what you can do is before the conflict moment, you can work on one, just being aware, like one, being aware that this is a thing, that when I'm conflicted and when something presents me with a kind of moment of, I didn't expect this, oh gosh, and I don't know how to fix this, and I'm kind of ruminating, like be aware you're in a conflict. Like when my hands are cold, my feet are cold, my appetite's down, when I'm not sleeping very well and my mind keeps ruminating on something, be conscious that this, I need, I would like to find a resolution to this as quickly as possible, not to add another reason to freak out, because people will do that. People will kind of learn this map and then be freaked out about freaking out. They'll worry about worrying. And it's like, that's not helpful. What we want to do is develop sufficient awareness to know that, yes, when there's unresolved stuff in my life, I realize that my biology, I may, again, not know exactly what program I'm running right now, but I know I'm running a program. And so through awareness, you can be able to recognize and to downgrade. Okay, this is unexpected. This is still unresolved. I don't know what I'm going to do about this. I don't know how this is going to play out, because that's the thing too, is Hammer was very much about, a biological resolution, because the mother, whose child is in the hospital, and it's like 50-50. The child's going to either be fine or they're not going to be fine. And it's like that whole time, it's like, what are we going to tell the mother to meditate until she feels better? It's like she needs a resolution to her conflict. And her conflict is either her child makes it or her child, doesn't make it. And she starts processing and grieving the loss. And so, but the longer you're in that kind of limbo of like uncertainty, make it, not make it, coming to terms with either outcome, getting to the point where it's like, okay, can I, and it may be, again, very difficult for some like to manage that. Like sometimes I'll talk to a person and it sounds like you're maximally in the middle of this conflict, that a resolution isn't possible for, court reasons. I talked to someone recently and, she's like, yeah, I think I'm in this conflict, but, and I'm working to kind of downgrade and shift my perspective of it and kind of use kind of mental alchemy to like chill out about this thing. However, until this court thing is finalized, until this thing, and that's not for, 2.5 months, until this is finalized, there's a part of me that just kind of keeps going back to it, and so in those situations, it's, we want to find a practical resolution if possible. And if that's not possible, can I reach like a transcendent perspective? Like, can I go beyond the conflict in some way to bring about some type of resolution that doesn't seem possible kind of down in when I'm in it? it doesn't seem like I can't resolve this until this thing changes, but can you get to another perspective? And so that's, one of the biggest things that when I learned this model, and I'm like, okay, that's people need access to tools at every level, tools on the ground. How do we practically resolve this? How quickly can we, get this resolution? Or how can I change my perspective, sometimes even of life and death? Sometimes we have to go there to your existential cosmic beliefs about life itself in order to, find a way to downgrade or to resolve a conflict related to, to loss, to separation. You have to believe certain things like about yourself in order to have a self-devaluation conflict. So it's like, let's go to work on those beliefs. Is this true? Have I ever questioned my beliefs about myself and my value and my worth and where it comes from? So we kind of get into the constructs, the mental constructs that cause us to get trapped in certain conflict themes. Like a person who has self-devaluation, it's like, what do you believe about yourself? What do you think about your value? What do you think about your performance? And so there are a lot of inroads, a lot of ways to kind of work with this model. But ultimately, from the animal body perspective, it's like, we really want to do our best to facilitate an environmental shift, because that's going to be it's going to speak the loudest to the biology. I'm safe now. And unfortunately, the modern world, everything about modern conventional living is just, it's like all the conflicts are baked into the cake from the very first ultrasound, everything that happens during a pregnancy, birth itself, huge conflict shocks, hospitalization, huge conflict shocks, taking a child into the doctor, conflict shock, all the time. And so separation from the mother. And so our society, and that was Hammer, like when you really, really deeply understand the implications of this, it goes so far beyond, just understanding the connection between, conflict and symptom development. It's about society. It's about how life is, so even the name, like German New Medicine, like the Germanische Heilkunde, Germanic isn't about like the country Germany. It's about the ancient Germanic peoples. And the Germanic people, they lived by this, and they lived in harmony with nature. And they didn't, their lifestyle was very harmonious. They had, weekly gatherings to kind of like clear the air and to talk about our conflicts we have with one another. And they didn't, they were very supportive of like the family. The units of family stayed together. The community was helpful to each other in a way that's like, okay, where do people have conflicts now? Separation, no family, no money, no support, the government. And so that's why everything about our governmental structure and lifestyle would change dramatically if every person understood these biological laws and started living biologically. That's kind of where we would have to go, because otherwise, yes, we can do kind of like psychological tricks to be like, okay, I'm fine with this. Well, I can kind of transcend. Let me go to, it's actually very interesting. There's a whole branch of this work about what Dr. Hammer called conflict constellations. And so this is where you have conflicts on both sides of the hemispheres of the brain. And depending on the specific combination, so the constellation, you manifest different psychic or psychological behaviors. So, for example, the flying constellation. A lot of people have the flying constellation. And this is when you have a territorial fear, conflict, and a scare fright at the same time. Basically, the system is shocked by this overwhelming, scary fears, and so it leaves. It actually develops a new reality. And so, people who are really into esoteric stuff, if they're really into aliens and outer space or Star Trek or Harry Potter, if they escape into like a fantasy world, they're really into spirituality. It's because they have this flying constellation where reality is too scary. Based on their conflicts that they had, like living in the real world is scary. And what's safer is to live in the world of the mind, or the world of, the esoteric, the angels and the this and the that. And they live somewhere else. Or there's a post-mortal constellation, a nympho constellation, an autistic constellation. So a person who develops characteristics of autism means they had a scare fright conflict and a territorial anger. And so they withdraw. Again, they kind of go into their own world. And so that's where, before I used to think that autism was a direct result of vaccination, that it was poison, that this is damaging the body. But then again, I knew people who had vaccinations who didn't develop autism. And then I also knew people who didn't vaccinate their children at all and their child developed autism. And again, that was one of those really baffling situations before I had this model. But now I know it's scare, fright, territorial anger. When those are active in the brain at the same time, the autistic constellation develops and the person will start to exhibit those characteristics. And so, yeah, those are just another amazing set of understanding of, again, the depth of what a person is dealing with and how a person copes, depends on their constellations.
Hmm. Wow. Very interesting. So can you relate it to like mental illnesses as well?
Well, that's what the constellations are. So like schizophrenia, bipolar, those have to do with tracks, depression, mania. And so it's so interesting, the right and the left side of the brain. And also it has to do with sexuality. So this describes everything, from homosexuality to transsexuality. Like it has to do with conflicts on either side of the cerebral cortex and in the temporal lobe. And so like the left side of the brain controls the estrogen level, the right side of the brain controls the testosterone levels. And so when a right-handed woman, when she has a sexual conflict, it affects the left side of her brain. Her estrogen goes down, her testosterone goes up. This is very common in young girls who become tomboyish. It's like, oh, one day she's very girly and all of a sudden she became a tomboy and she wants to wear a backwards hat and wants to, work on cars. And, she changed, her personality changed. Well, what that indicates is prior to that happening, she had a sexual shock. And so this could have been, she went to a doctor's appointment and there was some type of exam that gave her a sexual shock. It could have been something obvious like molestation or abuse. It could have been even just walking in on her parents having an intimate moment together. That can be a sexual shock. Obviously, television. I remember specific movies that gave me sexual shocks when I was a child, where it's something of a sexual nature that I was not prepared for. I didn't understand it when, and it was, but I got, this feeling of like, this was shocking to me in a sexual way. Obviously pornography, kids having access to telephones, all sorts of shocking things, even just regular TV, lots of things that a child who doesn't have like a framework for understanding what's going on, that can cause a sexual shock. And so what that does is that little girl, her estrogen goes down, her testosterone goes up, and she starts to have like a more masculine perspective. And this actually one of the reasons for so Hammer found that a girl, if she had no conflicts in her territorial areas, she'll start her period at age 11. And so she'll start ovulating and start having her menstrual cycle at age 11. But most girls don't start at age 11, they start after. And so if they start after, that means that they did have some type of sexual shock that caused them to become more masculine. And then when the period comes, it means that another conflict happened on the right side of the brain. And so this is actually the most complex thing to understand. Dr. Hammer calls it the higher mathematics, because it's a mathematical. There are these scales in the brain essentially that, like, when one conflict happens, we have this area is blocked and then the other one, and then depending on which one has more weight is going to depend on how you express. And so a person who kind of is bipolar, they swing. So that means that if they have a constellation and like their dad is the track for the sexual conflict, because that's another thing that can happen. So if your dad is unfaithful to your mother, or if something happens with your father where he no longer feels like a safe person, if there's a divorce, if there's loss, because a little girl, she's like, oh, I'm going to marry my daddy, and if dad leaves, that can be a sexual conflict for her. So divorce,
Very interesting.
disharmony within the relationship. The little girl, she no longer, she has a sexual conflict, she becomes more masculine. So her track for her sexual conflict is her dad. And then if she has another conflict on the right side, a territorial anger conflict with her mom, then she's going to swing back and forth. And so when she's with her dad, she's going to have one set of symptoms. She's going to be more manic. And then when she's with her mom, she's going to be more depressed. And then she's going to be manic and then depressed and then manic and then depressed. And what is that? That has to do with who she's around and who her tracks are related to. And then we're going to say, oh, well, she's bipolar, let's get her on medication. When we have to figure out, what was her conflict? Why is this conflict still happening? Sometimes, if the conflicts are really intense, an ideal situation might be to send the child to boarding school, actually get her away from the parents. Where another child, getting them away from the parents could be the conflict itself. And that's why this is all very unique, very individual to the person who experienced it. And so there isn't one size fits all. There isn't, this is how you resolve everything. There is, who's the child? Who are the parents? What's the experience? What's going to help her to get away from the things that are causing her to have constant tracks around these people?
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, well, we always get back to that. Health is very individual. Individuals are very individual, surprisingly enough. You know, depends on their story, it depends on everything. And I think that's a really important note, and I think that'd be a good place to kind of wrap things up. So, um, do you have any final thoughts, anything that you want to share, anything you might have missed or
No, I really recommend that you dive into this, like every person. So, one of my mentors and teachers, Helmut Pilhar, he passed a couple of years ago, but he says, make this your hobby. Like, this is, you don't want, because it's so unfortunate. We should have known this map your whole life. Every doctor you've ever seen, everybody should know this map inside and out. It should be second nature. You should know what causes a toothache. You should know what causes a pimple. You should know what causes an earache, a sty in your eye, hair loss. You should know all of this. Because if you don't know it, when a symptom happens, you get scared because the whole system, our whole lives, just the cultural consciousness is scary things cause symptoms. Bad things cause symptoms. If a symptom's happening, something scary and bad is probably going on inside of your body, and it could get worse and you could, die. And so if you have those beliefs kind of clanging around, you need this map because this map brings peace. This map brings freedom. This map brings understanding. And unfortunately, most of the people, a lot of the people that I end up interacting with, they already have a diagnosis. They come across the map because they have a diagnosis and they're like, God, there's got to be some other explanation. This model isn't making sense to me. And then they find it. But unfortunately, by the time you've already got an adaptation, like especially a big one, a big diagnosis, it's like, Helmut would say, it's like teaching a drowning person how to swim. It's like, these are skills, like you need these skills to navigate in the water. And so make this your hobby. Learn a little bit about it every single day. If somebody has a symptom, if you see I use celebrities a lot as examples. It's like, if a celebrity has a symptom, look up, what does this mean? Oh, so and so has prostate cancer. It's like, ooh, that means he's got a manliness conflict. Ooh, what else could? Oh, and this. Oh, that was right. His wife did cheat on him, or there was suspicion of this or that thing. It's like, learn this so that you know what your body is doing, what your children, this is absolutely vital for parents, why your child has a symptom. When you get it, when you understand it, it's like, okay, this is the same thing with your pets. If your pet is dealing with something, they have a conflict. And so if you have this map, you have the peace of mind. But it's an undertaking. It's learning a little bit about it every single day. And, it's very complex, but there's ways for you to, every person has the capacity to understand this and start to apply it in their life. And so that would be my encouragement to everyone.
cool. And so is the best way to learn about it to just study this map? What do you mean by the map? Is that it behind you there? Kind of just like a
Yeah, so this is
dictionary almost? Yeah.
Yes, this is the scientific chart, and so this can be purchased. I have a link on my website, so drmelissasell.com. If you go to the blog and getting started with GNM or Germanic healing knowledge, there's a list of links and books, and there's a training program. So Helmut Pilhar, so his daughter, like in 1995, got diagnosed with a Wilms tumor, with cancer, and it was this whole big thing. And it ended up being a starvation conflict because of the mother that went to work. It's such an amazing story. But he, got involved with Dr. Hammer and didn't want to do chemo for his daughter. He ended up getting chased through Europe, him and his children and his wife. They drove from Austria or Germany to Spain, and they're trying to escape Interpol that's trying to track them down to basically force give their child chemotherapy. So it was like this huge, highly publicized case. And so after that, I mean, Helmut, he understood everything that Dr. Hammer was saying was accurate and correct. And he saw the politics that were involved in literally forcing his child to get chemo. It's like such a crazy story. And so Helmut, after that, he just was like so devoted to Dr. Hammer, and he was his lecturer. So Helmut would travel all over Europe, like 250 days a year. Like most of the year, he's traveling, giving the seminars, disseminating the information, telling people this is how it works, this is how it works, this is how this organ works, this is how this works. And so his Dr. Hammer on his 80th birthday gave permission to Helmut to turn these seminars that he would give live into online courses. And so he made it into an online course in German. And in the last couple of years, the German courses have been translated into English. And so that's what I consider absolute must-haves, is these courses from Helmut. And you can get to those links through the GHK Academy, and that's on that blog as well. And they're just amazing. There's stories from Dr. Hammer, examples, the basics, all the way through the constellations. And so that's kind of what I consider the best resource for learning it. This is the map. So this one, you have to have a little bit of uh, anatomy knowledge, and I have a course or a weekly class that I teach for really helping to break it down for a person in their daily life. And so my language of adaptation class is another great option for learning it. But go to that blog page and you'll get the books. There's a lot of different books, and people are coming out with more and more tools for people to check out to really understand and learn it.
Yeah. So you mentioned your website. How can the listener learn from you? You mentioned that weekly little seminar you put on. How can they learn from you? How can they support you?
Yeah. So drmelissacell.com. Also, I have a YouTube channel that has a bunch of videos. So that's actually a really great first stop, is the YouTube and the podcast. Germany Medicine 101 on YouTube will really just kind of give you a breakdown of all the biological laws. And so, yeah, you can jump into my world at any one of those points. And I do consult with people. So if you want to, talk about your symptoms, and I can help you to, it's always going to be pointing you back to self-education. But I can kind of talk you through, this is what here's your symptom. This is what conflict it is. And so, what was going on in your life, and can we, go deeper into your experience and figure out what's going to be the resolution to this? Because only again, back to the individual thing, it's like you have to figure out what happened to me. Why did this, what it was, the experience that I felt. And so it is a beautiful map for self-knowledge, for self-evolution, for growth and expansion. And so, it's really so incredible. So you will enjoy this journey.
Amazing. Amazing. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Definitely. I want to thank you all for listening. I should know that this is not medical advice. This is for informational purposes only. But remember that we're all responsible, sovereign beings capable of thinking, criticizing, and understanding absolutely anything. We, the people in the greater forces, are together self healers, self governable, self teachers, and so much more. Please reach out if you want to have a chat about this or anything. You know where to find me. Out there on Instagram is the best place. And yeah, if you found this informative or helpful or insightful in any way, give us a like, share, comment, subscribe, review, whatever platform you're on. That's the best way to support me. There's links down below if you'd like to donate as well. Everything goes right back into this. This is it. This is the passion, guys. We're working hard on this. So I'd really appreciate that. Not necessary, but yeah, support in any way is greatly appreciated. So just remember, there are two types of people in this world: those who believe they can, those who believe they can't, and they're both correct. All right, guys, take care.